Hi guys! Today we'll be recapping a story called Talented Baby Squirrel. Please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. Enjoy! At first, everything is confusing. A girl is being directed by her aunt to greet someone, reminding her to kneel before His Royal Highness. But the last thing Betty remembers is succumbing to the painful embrace of death. To her shock, the person who now stands before her is the younger version of the same person who stood before her as she bleeds to death, relishing her tragic end. He is Prince Reader, the childhood friend who killed her. When she utters his name in shock, the prince is amused that she already knows his name. Her aunt, Viscountess Heiress, instantly yells at her for being rude to the prince. Only after hearing her aunt's screeching voice does she realize what day it is. It's the day she first met Reader. Did she travel back in time? When she hears the prince say that it's okay that she's acting like that since they just met, anger is quick to rise within her. Reader is a noble snake shifter, and she recalls all the times he gaslighted her by saying that he doesn't care that she is just an insignificant squirrel shifter because he still considers her his friend. What a two-faced guy! She used to believe all his saccharine words until he pierced her with his venomous fangs. He betrayed her right when she was about to reach her dream. Since she was a child, she has always been alone, and books were her only friend until she met him. Back then, she was bewildered when her aunt told her that she was chosen to marry the second prince of the empire. She was forced to listen to her aunt instruct her on how to practically be a slave to the prince, ordering her to behave herself and not to raise her voice. She felt like she was meeting a monster. But Reader Duastrom is none of that. At least, not from the outside. He made her feel accepted even though the signum on her wrist, a piece of star that symbolizes her status as a shapeshifter, is black. He tells her that it's as pretty as the rest and that he is always on her side. Soon enough, he becomes her one and only friend. This is a testament to all of us. Never trust people easily. But despite being engaged to the prince, her aunt still controlled every aspect of her life. Purina did not want to spend a single penny on her niece, so Betty lived in utter poverty. Fortunately, she was able to find solace in reading and exploring the garden as a squirrel. One day, Reader stumbles upon her reading a book about commerce. Betty naively shares with him her dream of becoming a merchant. She desires to leave the tiny place she is used to and explore the new world far away from all the torment. Strangely enough, Reader's aura suddenly darkens when she talks about leaving. Still, he promises to support his friend's dream. Betty carefully planned her most awaited escape in order to live her life as a merchant. Reader, her most trusted friend, promised to help her realize her dream. Swayed by his words and affection, Betty ends up sharing every aspect of her plan with him, from the money she has saved and even the guild she plans to apply to. Most importantly, she confides when she plans to leave, and it's during her coming-of-age ceremony. However, true to his shapeshifter form, the prince bit her neck with his fangs the day before her escape. He also steals the signum from her wrist. What's even more surprising, although no one is shocked really, is her aunt's involvement. It seems to her that the two of them have planned her death all along. Now, as she stands before the one who would end her life, all she can feel is an overwhelming rage. Without hesitation, she marches in front of him and slaps his face with all her might. She may be a tiny thing, but that slap sure looks like it hurt quite a bit. Take that, would-be backstabber! She even attacks him head-on, determined to pull out those sharp fangs with her bare hands. It takes a couple of guards to remove her from the prince. Betty is clever enough to know that she can't stay there, so she shapeshifts. With her squirrel form, she easily evades capture, fleeing away from her tormentors. She runs, and she does not look back. She eventually finds herself on top of a wagon heading north to the Duchy of Aslan. She thought that she'd be happy that she was leaving, but that was still the place that she had grew up in. The place where she met the person who she thought was her friend. Meanwhile, Purina is raging. She screams about how ungrateful Betty is. Ha! The audacity of this woman! The prince, on the other hand, is taken aback that Betty managed to forcefully knock out one of his loose baby teeth. Reader then turns to the Viscountess Heiress and comments that the encounter was unexpected. He then accuses her of wanting to side with his older brother instead based on how her niece is acting. The Viscountess is now kneeling before him, and she swears that her loyalty stands with him alone. She promises to sort everything out by telling the Duke that the girl has simply run away. Unknown to them, Betty will soon reach the gates of the Northern Duke's castle. The reason she made it all the way here is because she happens to hear about it in the carriage that she jumped onto. She was so determined to make Reader pay for his betrayal. She then remembered how much Reader hated his older brother, the first prince. Now that she had returned her 8-year-old self, she could now confide to the first prince about Reader's weaknesses. Unfortunately, there was no way for her to meet the first prince because he was fighting in a faraway war. To make matters worse, she doesn't even have a place to stay in. That is when she heard the people in the carriage discussing how the Golden Lion Duke had defeated the Holy Imperial Army in the first battle. This victory is the beginning of the end of the Great War, but Betty knew that there would be an unexpected event that caused the Golden Duke's army's retreat. She then realized that she could use her knowledge of the future to prevent this from happening. The Golden Lion Duke of the North, Leonhardt el de Aslan, is the father she never knew. A person she has never called father despite being his daughter. Not once did her father visit her, and despite writing countless letters, the only response she ever got was him sending back one of her letters in shreds. Even though she is the child he has abandoned, she will make a proposition he can't refuse. She will ask him to let her stay in his castle until she becomes an adult. Now, however, her current dilemma is how to enter the castle in the first place. At that moment, the soldiers at the gate spot her in her adorable squirrel form. To her surprise, they are accommodating to her presence. They clearly recognize her as the daughter of their master. One of them even goes so far as to carry her inside on his palm like she's something precious. Even more strange is the fact that everyone seems to be so taken by her. The butler, Miss Joanna, eventually arrives at the scene, bewildered by her sudden presence. Betty instantly thinks that the woman would kick her out for being filthy or for being a squirrel. But to her surprise, Joanna despairs that her once chubby cheeks are now hollow. The butler is quick to give her snacks to nibble on to her heart's content. She wonders why everyone is being nice to her, but she convinces herself not to be fooled by anyone. She knows that in this world, no one is nice for no reason, and so she tells Joanna that she must speak with the household head. Upon hearing that the young lady wants to make a deal, Joanna naively assumes that the child simply misses her father, but she has to explain that the Duke has gone far off. Rather than be put off, Betty merely asks for whoever is in charge at the moment. But right then, a person slamming the door interrupted them. Carlitos el Aslan, the firstborn son of the Duke, enters the scene with blood smeared all over him. The boy greets her, addressing her as a runaway squirrel. My gosh, this boy is still a teen, but we can already tell that their genes are godlike. Joanna quickly tells the young lord off, saying that the lady is still young. They instantly wipe the blood off from all over the boy's face so as not to scare the child. Although she's never met him in person, she has seen his portrait before. She knows that the boy is Carlitos el Aslan, the genius swordsman who has been on countless battlefields since he was 10. He is so merciless that more often than not, his hair is covered in blood, which is why he is also known as the Red Lion. Betty can't believe that this person is her brother. Based on his reaction, Betty assumes that he's not very happy that she is his sister. She visibly deflates due to the uncomfortable feeling. But to her surprise, Carlitos marches towards her, questioning why she smells like a snake. Betty looks back at the sheer intensity of Carlitos' eyes. That is when she notices the golden eyes that symbolizes the blood of Aslan. A simple gaze from a lion shifter can easily subdue people. However, instead of feeling oppressed, she feels an inexplicable warmth and coziness from that gaze. Carlitos suddenly comments that she doesn't seem to be afraid of him. Betty is startled when the boy lifts her up, so she tries to struggle. But to her surprise, he hugs her. When he lets go, he declares that she now smells like she should. Betty freezes in his arm, unused to being touched so familiarly. Carlitos is confused by her behavior, even more so when she scurries away from him, demanding her space back. Betty has never experienced such a thing before. She feels like her heart is about to burst. Joanna is worried for the young miss, especially since she starts trembling. The butler scolds the young master to be more careful with his little sister. Betty is becoming more convinced that her brother doesn't like her, especially when he merely addresses her as that thing. As far as he knows, she still doesn't have a name. Betty becomes even more upset, remembering how for a long time no one has even bothered to give her a name. But around the time that she was 10 years old, before she traveled back in time, she received the first and last letter from her father, and it contained her name. She shouts that she does have a name, and it's Betty. Carlitos is certainly taken aback by this. Even though she thinks that her father was proving how much he doesn't care about her, she still considered that name she was given as something precious. Suddenly, Joanna declares that she knows the meaning of that name, and it's a blessing. She compliments the young lady for her lovely name, asking her if she came up with the name herself. Betty is flustered, but she answers that it was given to her. When Carlitos suddenly calls her by her name, Betty can't help but be agitated because it feels so strange. But this instantly turns to annoyance when her brother insists on calling her Bushy Tail instead. It's because she's the size of his tail tuft as a lion. Betty is definitely upset by the playful nickname. They are so cute. They just met and they're now acting like siblings. Joanna has to interrupt their adorable banter. She tells Betty that since the Duke is not present, she can talk to the Lord handling all the house's affairs. The butler exits the room to call the Lord, but not before telling the children to get to know each other while she's gone. Betty is frightened that she has to spend alone time with her brother. As Joanna is walking down the hall, she is thinking about the North's custom of not naming a child until they know their temperament. This custom is even more evident when the child is showered with love, since finding the perfect name is quite difficult. But then again, not naming an 8-year-old is extreme. She just hopes that he would stop calling the young lady as his baby anymore. OMG, we are getting contradicting information here. But could it be that the Duke is actually a loving father all this time? Meanwhile, there is an awkward silence between the siblings. Carlitos is observing his little sister, noting how small and fluffy she is. He is even quite upset that he did not witness her in her squirrel form. So he approaches her once again, telling her to turn into a squirrel. He is being intimidating again, so Betty quickly assumes that he wants to harm her in her most vulnerable form. What is curious for the young lord is the fact that Betty is not running away from him. This is strange for him because he is so used to all cute things fearing him. Remembering small animals fleeing from his grasps upsets him, and this shows on his face. Betty assumes that she has upset him. She has never interacted with her brother before, so she thinks it's not fair to distance herself from him. It won't hurt to be on good terms with him, so she turns into a squirrel just like he asked. Carlitos can't take her adorableness. He even proclaims that they look alike because he has rounded ears in his animal form too. The young lord then hands her a seed to nibble on. Not wanting to be rude, Betty climbs on his palm and starts munching. Carlitos, on the other hand, is mesmerized by her cuteness. I can relate, dear Carlitos. She is simply too cute for her own good. While the young lord is busy admiring his sister, Joanna bursts in the room, urgently telling her that the Duke wants to speak with her. She can't believe that he wants to meet her right that instant. She is not yet ready to face him. Betty is shocked but goes along as the butler helps her dress. Soon they arrive at the office where the Duke usually handles his affairs. When they enter, Betty finally meets Count Zelot. He introduces himself, so Betty enthusiastically greets him back. The Count explains that the Duke has asked him to contact him using a communication device so he can speak to his daughter. When she asks the Count why her father wants to speak with her, the Count tells her that it's because the lady is acting like a baby. He explains that it's natural to want to visit family, but the North is at war. I am getting so much negative vibes from this guy. You better prove me wrong, Count. Betty is embarrassed that she is being called out for acting like a baby when she only wanted to prevent the initial retreat. Betty starts recalling all the hurtful words her aunt used to tell her, calling her useless and annoying. Fortunately, Carlitos is there to notice her discomfort. He places a hand on her shoulders and points out to the Count that he is becoming needlessly chatty. Soon enough, the device begins vibrating, indicating that the Duke is trying to contact them. Betty has to place her hand on the object, and suddenly, she can finally hear her father's voice. His first words is questioning why she came to the North. Betty has to stop for a moment to take in his voice for the first time. Somehow, it has the power to lure people in. Once again, the Duke speaks, asking her if something happened in the capital. That is when she realizes that something did happen. She slapped a prince! Betty doesn't know what to do. She knows that her father would consider her a disgrace for assaulting royalty. Once again, the Duke questions her if something happened. OMG, gorgeousness certainly runs in the family. This guy has no business being this handsome. Betty knows she can't lie about this since the Duke probably already knows that she slapped the prince, so she decides to tell him the truth. Her father and brother are shocked by this. She explained how her aunt arranged a marriage between her and the second prince. Betty is sure that her father would think that she's such a troublemaker, but that's not the case. Her brother even tells her that she did a good job since marriage is out of the question. Her father then voices how upset he is that her aunt would dare force a marriage he didn't approve of. The Duke assures her that he will send a rejection letter as soon as the war is over, so she should return to the capital for now. Betty is crestfallen upon hearing this. She understands that the North is currently considered a battlefield, but she has to fight to stay there. She unconsciously drops her tail, indicating how upset she is. Carlitos notices and touches the device to know what his father is saying to upset his sister. Carlitos asks her if she doesn't want to leave. When she tells him that she doesn't, he tries to convince their father to let her stay. But the Duke is not budging at all. Betty now knows that her father really hates that she's there. What surprised her is how her brother is taking her side. Carlitos explains that his sister needs to rest, otherwise she'll collapse on her way to the capital. This finally convinces the Duke, stating that she can stay there until he returns. Betty is ecstatic, and she thanks her brother for his help. Unexpectedly, her brother asks to touch her tail. She has to give in out of gratitude. As Carlitos admires her fluffy tail, news of the military on fire reaches them. All the provisions needed by the Duke's army are stocked there. Everyone is frantically trying to put out the fire. Betty realizes that this may be when the initial retreat began. The initial retreat is when the Duke's army, who has won every battle, suddenly retreated. The people who once admired the Golden Lion Duke ridiculed him for it. The reason for the retreat was never disclosed. It turns out that the reason behind it is because the food supply burned in a fire. The soldiers starved, and a great disaster is bound to hit the continent soon. Both the Duke's military and duchy population dwindled because of these events. Betty knows that she has to stop all of these things from happening, and she will do so by using a random plant. Carlitos manages to capture a suspected culprit, but he doubts his credibility since catching him was too easy. He knows that someone else is behind this sabotage. There's confusion as to what they should do next. Count Zilot then arrives, and he confesses to Carlitos that he should have taken more precaution as the one in charge of the Duke's affairs. The Count is telling him how sorry he is for not being able to prevent the fire. Drama much? This guy is becoming more and more suspicious. You can smell the gaslight from a mile away. Even Carlitos is bothered that even though he is apologizing, he seems too relaxed. That's when Betty decides to interrupt. She declares that she has a solution to their problem, showing them a root crop. Everyone is stunned because it's called the devil's fruit, known for being poisonous. Betty explains that the fruit is called tuberosum, and it doesn't deserve all those bad names. She tells them that it's a miracle plant. Once again, the meddlesome Count Zilot uses his gaslight powers to dissuade Betty, telling her to go play with a maid if she's bored. Rather than be disheartened, Betty explains the benefits of the plant, but the others still doubt her. To prove to them that the plant will not cause stomachache, she eats one of the fruits without hesitation. As expected, everyone panics and they instantly call for a physician. Continuing from the last chapter, everyone around Betty is worried she's going to show any signs of poisoning from ingesting the devil's fruit, tuberosum. The family doctor finally speaks his verdict. Betty is showing no signs of poisoning at all. Her brother Carl wants to be 110% sure, so he menacingly asks again, to which the doctor gets scared and explains further that the poison would have been seen in Betty's tongue. Carl, you really do care so much for your sister, huh? Betty then takes tuberosum in its entirety, from its stem down to its fruit. She proudly announces that it's edible. Carl believes her, but he can't make out what makes it non-poisonous. He hypothesizes that there could be certain groups of the plant that are non-edible and edible, to which Betty tells him it's wrong. A knight speaks up and thinks maybe it's because she's a squirrel shifter that she can digest anything, including poison. However, Betty rejects that thought as well. Betty finally shows them the answer. It's the stalk. Apparently, if ingested prior to the rest of the plant, one would have a neutralization from the poison. She had one prior to meeting with everyone, so by the time she ate the fruit, she already was neutralized from its poison. This fact is something that would be discovered a year or two from this moment, as our adorable female lead recalls from her past life. Ironically, this is found out when someone tries to unalive themselves by eating the entire plant. But of course, they don't end up dying. Undoubtedly, that person must feel like he's the unluckiest man alive. Despite Betty's explanation and even demonstration, the knights are still hesitant to try it themselves. Carl immediately takes a plant and ingests it as a whole. The knights are shocked as he eats it with no hesitation. Truly, Carl's trust for his baby sister is so wholesome. Seconds after the ingestion, nothing happens. Carl is totally fine. The knights are moved by his sacrifice. Some are still hesitant as both of those who tested the plant are shifters. But there are some who try it right away. Everyone eats the fruit and finds themselves well, not to mention filled as well. Betty proudly announces that this is how they'll resolve the food supply issue since there's an abundance of tuberosums around them. They all discuss how they'll deliver it right away, as Betty gets to write a letter about how to ingest the plant so that it may fill the knights at war's stomachs, avoiding the fate of retreat. Our brilliant female lead is happy that things are going well for her. Using this chance, she will make an appeal to her father and ask him that she'll be allowed to stay here until her coming-of-age ceremony. On the other hand, Count Zalot doesn't want the problem to be resolved this fast. He's anxiously thinking of what to report to her. Ha! I knew he was up to no good. He already emitted suspicious energy right from the start. I wonder who this her he's referring to. Just as the knights at war are about to faint from hunger, the food supply finally arrives. Head Leonhardt, Betty and Carl's father, takes Betty's letter and reads it right away. She claims that the food supply is edible and can help as they have an ongoing war. At first, he thought it was a mistake, seeing as the supplies were all the tuberosums, but the knight reads another letter that explains how it's eaten. Of course, the knights are doubtful as she's only 8 years old. Since this is all his beloved daughter's idea, Leonhardt eats the entire plant with zero hesitation, which leads to the rest of the knights admiring him for doing such a sacrificial feat. This is exactly the same panel as when Carl did it too. Because of this, everyone is recharged and ready to continue their war. Back at his own tent, Leonhardt lovingly reads his daughter's letter. With the way he acts, there's definitely a reason behind as to why he supposedly abandoned her. Back in the castle prior to the delivery of the food rations is where Betty currently is, writing her letter for her father. Because of her experience in her past life, she's able to compose a letter that even Joanna thought was cute of her to add expressions that make her sound mature. Betty is happy that she's being helpful towards many people and decides to help out more by picking up tuberosome plants. Carl appears and tells her not to, as she's had a long day and deserves to sleep. Joanna then mentions having Betty's room ready. Betty is surprised to hear this. She actually has a room prepared for her? For the sweet little baby? Of course there is! Betty thinks everyone is being strange, as she's not attuned to such kindness, especially in her past life. Her older brother offers to show her to her room, which turns out to be a long corridor? Betty knew she wasn't welcomed. Is this their way of telling her that she doesn't belong here? However, much to her surprise, and quite fortunately, this isn't the case. Carl grabs her hand and leads to different doors, each one leading to different kinds of rooms too. Betty even has her own playroom. She still doesn't believe this is all hers, but Carl is consistent in reassuring that all of this is. Aw, best brother ever! Carl picks her up to her room and shows her the beautiful horizon by her room's huge windows. Now Betty is glad that she has been courageous. If it weren't for her impulsiveness to leave the capital, she wouldn't experience this kindness and beauty of her environment. Carl places his little sister to bed. The sun is still up and she can't sleep at all. He figures that she won't be able to sleep anytime soon, so he pulls out a running wheel. Since she's a squirrel, he thought she'd like the idea. He looks around and decides on something else. A squirrel mansion! Betty is just speechless while Carl is excited about it. Well, apparently, it seems that Carl is having more fun than her. Joanna comes in and sees the siblings in the middle of dress-up, with Betty transformed into her squirrel self. Joanna is delighted to see them get along with each other, while little Betty thinks her brother is just messing with her. She couldn't say no to him just as he begged her with teary eyes. Later on, Betty is in her kitty nightgown, to which she comments that the Aslan family is probably really generous towards guests. When she gets back to her room, she is greeted by Carl, who had been waiting for her. He wants to tuck her in for the night. He plops her down on the bed and then makes her comfortable before telling her goodnight. He even calls her by her name this time instead of the usual bushy tail. Betty feels warm, as she has never been tucked into sleep before. Oh, Betty, you precious baby, you deserve all the love in the world. Meanwhile, at the other part of the mansion, Count Zelot is vehemently frustrated that his plan was ruined all because of a teeny squirrel. The magic ball zaps as someone is trying to contact him. It's the second queen from Astrum Kingdom. She looks like Reader, especially with that sinister look. She's been trying to contact Zelot, yet to no avail. She has no choice but to command Betty's aunt, Viscountess Heiress, to take matters into her own hands. And she better not fail this time. Oh no, this sounds like bad news for our little Betty. It's another great day for Betty. The maids wake her up and immediately have her dressed. The only problem is, she has to wear at least 7 dresses. The maids are having fun playing dress-up, and Betty is cute in anything that she wears. Seeing as how cute their little master is, it's definitely no surprise. However, poor little Betty doesn't appreciate being called cute, as she associates the word with how the butlers and maids in the capital would use it when complimenting money and jewelry. In other words, for her, it's a word used when something of value came into someone's hands. She panics at the thought of eventually realizing that she has become someone's possession. Oh, my sweet child, I hope you heal from your traumas. Being the strong girl she is now, she announces that she belongs to herself. The maids look at each other confused before agreeing to her. They thought that Betty has a boy telling her that she belongs to him, so they praise her for being courageous, which in turn confuses Betty even further. Finally, after so many dresses, they finally are able to pick one for today. Just as Betty is being escorted to the dining room, a maid approaches her and thanks her for her help regarding the food source problem in the battlefield. Apparently, her boyfriend is a soldier and is part of the war alongside Leonhardt. Betty feels happy that she was able to help people this way. She hopes deep inside that this sort of warmth won't suddenly disappear like a bunch of clouds. Afterwards, who meets her in the dining room is none other than her older brother. Betty wants to get on his good side, and by doing so, she avoids eating with him, as this is because of her past. Her aunt kept telling her that she made her lose her appetite, so she believed that as a fact. That's why when Carl tells her to sit with him, she doesn't believe what she's hearing. She joyfully joins him as they eat their meal together. Betty wanders around the corridor, wondering why everyone is being nice to her. She reaches a conclusion that they probably just don't know that the head of his house, her father, hates her. She then believes that once Leonhardt comes back, everyone will hate her just as they used to in her past life. My heart aches for her in this scene. The least she can do right now is give back to everyone in her own little way. In that regard, Betty suddenly has an idea. She plans to gather berries, a specialty of hers even from her past life, and give them to everyone. She gives a pile of it to Carl, who has been supportive and kind to her since day one. He's touched and promises to give her something in return, something that she will like. As Betty went for more berries outside, she touched a tree. She feels a huge energy emitting from it. It's as if it's calling her. Before she could wander mindlessly, a maid thankfully stops her, bringing Betty back to reality. Just as things couldn't get any more wrong, a magical beast in the form of a white squirrel leaps on Betty and teleports her somewhere else. Everyone around her panics until Carl arrives too. Carl is furious to know that a magical beast has taken his little sister to who knows where. Before Carl arrives, he has also been looking for a gift to give to Betty. He thinks that she'll love having a snow fox fur. He promises not to have blood on him the next time she sees him, as Joanna advises. Upon going back after his successful kill, everyone informs him that Betty is kidnapped by the snowstorm squirrel. Carl furiously commands everyone to look for her everywhere. He can't risk losing his beloved sister like this. Big brother responsibilities! Will we see Carl's lion form? Somewhere else in the northern mountains, Betty is safe and sound, all in one piece. She hears a gentle voice, and it's coming from the snowstorm squirrel. The squirrel floats as it communicates with Betty through her head. It calls her Crumbs. It explains to her that she is its star crumb. Betty understands that she may be her ancestor. It's then revealed that it was the one who turned back Betty's time to save her. Before it can explain the most important thing to Betty, its spirit comes out of the snowstorm squirrel's vessel. Betty is left with the squirrel. She now realizes that she's in the middle of nowhere. She hears some rustling leaves and immediately gets scared, since northern mountains are known for their large beasts. A voice calls out to her, a familiar voice. A boy, his eyes covered with his hair, in a black and gold cloak, emerges from the trees. Who's this new and mysterious character? Betty assesses the stranger in the cloak. His height is like that of her brother's, and his voice too. She assumes that he's around his age. She asks him questions and realizes that this stranger is actually wary of her. Our kind-hearted female lead assures him that she's just as lost as he is. This seems to work as the aura between them lights up. He chuckles at her. Who wouldn't, though? She's being cute as heck. Just as she's about to start walking back home, heavy rain suddenly falls on them. The strange boy has her stand beside him under the protection of the tree's shade. The snowstorm squirrel gets out from Betty's bag, which turns the strange boy into defensive mode. Why is everyone getting hyped up by a cute animal? Betty stops him and begs him for its life, so he gives in, but promises that if it shows the slightest bit of aggression, he'll have to get rid of it. Betty lets out a sneeze, as it's starting to get cold after all. The boy looks at her in concern and asks her to come with him. He calls her a pretty lady and has her hide under his cloak so that she wouldn't get wet. All this makes Betty get flustered, but she follows him nonetheless to an empty cabin. They get inside the cabin, where they're warm and sheltered. This boy is drenched because of her, and so she starts to feel bad, so she has him take off the cloak. She promises not to look at him, seeing that he seems rather hesitant to take everything off. He finally takes his wet cloak off and assures her that it's fine to look now. To her surprise, the one thing that gets her attention is the fact that there's a blindfold over his eyes. The cabin where Betty and the mystery boy are in is not warm enough, so they need to start a fire. The boy finds a pile of wood. Betty wonders how he's able to see with that blindfold. But as she accidentally stares too long, she notices that he's still good-looking even with the blindfold on. Doing a bit of sightseeing, are we, Betty? He asks her to sit close to the fire so they can get warm. She doesn't budge, so he offers his arms, asking her if she wants to be carried over. This makes Betty blush. To her credit, how could he say that so calmly? As they both sit down by the fire, she figures out what the books call people like him: a Casanova. For those who are wondering what that is, it essentially means a lover boy. Upon this realization, she groans as he really is the perfect example of one. She tries her best not to be suspicious, as she thinks he might take something away from her. Betty learned to be wary of these types of men. Out of nowhere, her stomach growls. She instantly regrets not taking her brother's offer of the turkey. Luckily, the boy has some bread he can share. She breaks the bread in half to give to him, but he insists that she take it all. Such a gentleman. Later on, his stomach growls too. Betty feels bad because she already has eaten everything, but she has an idea. She goes out in the cold and takes tuberosum plants. The boy suddenly has thoughts that Betty also wants him dead. There are others who do? And so he confronts her right away. The boy asks Betty if she wants to kill him too. Betty is just confused. Why on earth would she kill him when they just met? Is it possible that this boy also has some troubled past? He can't help but feel that everyone is out to get him because many have indeed tried to. Maybe that's why he has to cover his eyes. Fortunately, Betty realizes that the boy's heightened wariness was because of the devil's fruit she was going to offer. She then explains how to ingest the fruit without being poisoned, and makes her own cooking show with it. She actually makes grilled tuberosums. She takes out a stalk and tells him to take one first before eating the fruit. This has the boy bite off the stalk from her hand, a gesture that certainly startles the little lady. Whoa, now that's a bit weird. Anyway, now that he's full, Betty decides to look around the cabin. She goofily runs around looking at things. The boy just thinks to himself that she has not changed at all. Wait, they actually met before and Betty just didn't remember? What a plot twist! He remembers her goofiness and her small size, and most of all, her curiosity-filled eyes that are dark as the night sky. These might be eyes that he has already fallen for based on how he remembers her. He has a memory of her while being in rugged clothes back in the capital. Meanwhile, it finally stops raining. Betty is the first one to notice. She flings the door wide open and hears people looking for her. She then tells the boy that they can go together if he's heading the same direction. But he just places his hand on her head, telling her what might be the sweetest goodbye. When she looks behind him, he's already long gone, with no trace of his presence at all. I hope they meet again soon. All the while, Carl runs up to his little sister, asking if she got hurt. Just by the tree, the boy from earlier is still here and eavesdropping, even catching Betty's name. He finally shows a part of his eyes, and they were golden yellow, a sign that he's also a shifter. He claims to feel hurt that he never knew her name, but it's not like he told his. He had also assumed that she was a maid and not a noble lady. Considering that they met in the capital where she was abused and neglected, it isn't surprising that that was his impression of her. The boy scans Betty's brother, Carl. All of a sudden, Carl's eyes almost meet his. Good thing he also has good reflexes, or else he would have been found out. He finally goes on to wherever he's supposed to go, but he also tells himself to dig some information about House Aslan. Anyway, back to Betty and Carl. The latter threatens to kill the magical beast that's with her. Like earlier, Betty begs him not to. Before she can explain her reason, her vision starts to get blurry. She starts wobbling until she gives in and collapses in front of him. In Betty's room, Carl threatens the doctor because Betty is still not waking up and looks sick. While trying to stay calm and not scared, the doctor explains to Carl that Betty's body is different from Carl's, which is why she is sick because of the rain. While Carl is still processing the information, the doctor announces he will get more medicine for Betty to drink. Looking at the sleeping Betty, Carl promises to himself that he will protect her in the future. The next day, the maids are still worried since Betty still has a cold. Hearing Betty sneeze, they hurriedly cover Betty with a thick blanket and ask her if she wants hot cocoa. While Betty looks at the maids, the doctor weirdly informs Betty that she looks better than yesterday, but still tells her that she must rest until she fully recovers. After the doctor left, the maids reminded Betty to rest in bed again. Hearing this, Betty realizes that she has only recently been allowed to go out freely, since she was only allowed to stay in the house before, thus lying down is simple for her to follow. While on the bed, Betty overhears the maids talking about the Duke and his bodyguard arriving. Betty jumps out of bed and excitedly asks the maids if her father is coming home. No, she is so innocently cute! One maid, with a hint of concern, then reminds Betty to be careful since she's still sick, but the other maids tell her that Betty is happy because the Duke is returning. The maid then approaches Betty and tells her that the tuberosum that she instructed to deliver helped a lot for both the guards and the Duke, thus making them return home earlier than expected. Next, the people outside the castle are warmly welcoming and celebrating the return of the Duke and the guards. While the guards are walking towards the castle, they're talking about Betty being a genius at a young age and their desire to meet her. Meanwhile, Betty is busy preparing herself to meet the Duke. While the maids are fixing her dress, they tell Betty that it's okay to meet the Duke in her pajamas since Betty is still sick. But Betty replies that her image needs to be perfect since first impressions are essential. Betty hurriedly runs towards the castle entrance after hearing that the Duke has arrived. But Betty stops at the bottom of the stairs after seeing the Duke for the first time and is nervous as she looks into the Duke's eyes. Staring at Betty, the Duke asks the servants why Betty is at the castle's entrance. Hearing this, Betty then realizes that the Duke may not like her. She might have forgotten about it for a moment because everyone in the castle treats Betty warmly. On the other hand, the Duke reminds himself to stay calm and not hug Betty directly. When the Duke is about to pat Betty's head, she flinches and remembers her memories of her aunt hurting her. Carl then calls the Duke's attention by welcoming him. The Duke praises Carl for how smoothly the plan is carried out, but Carl informs the Duke that it was all Betty's idea, and that Betty took care of everything. Betty then formally tells the Duke that she wants to offer him a deal he won't regret accepting. While curious about why Betty is formally talking to him, the Duke tells the child that they will talk tomorrow. He then instructs the maid to bring Betty to her room and make her rest till she's stable. Betty then excitedly returns to her room and tells the maid that she will prepare for tomorrow's meeting with the Duke. Night falls. When the butler reports to the Duke, the maid arrives at the office and informs the Duke that Betty no longer has the flu. Hearing this, the Duke is relieved and realizes that Betty was small and weak before. However, Betty is growing up quickly, even running to greet him. Remembering Betty's scared reaction, the Duke asks his butler and the maid if his appearance is scary, to which the butler directly replies that the Duke does indeed give off that vibe, that the adults and kids fear him, and that even a glimpse of the Duke can make others shudder in fear. And so, the Duke decides to prepare something for Betty during their meeting. The next day, Betty is welcomed by many delicious pastries during her meeting with the Duke. Betty tries to stop herself from eating the pastries but fails. Meanwhile, the Duke is happy that Betty is eating his prepared pastries. Betty stops eating after noticing that the Duke is looking at her, thus she starts to report to him her plan. Betty informs the Duke that the northern mountain is their best defense, but its agriculture is terrible. Thus, they will get most of the food from the outside, which will be Aslan's first barrier. Betty then thinks that she'll use her plan for the Duke to make her stay in the castle. This poor baby is still traumatized because of her aunt. The Duke then tells Betty that she doesn't need to worry about the incoming winter because he already has plans with the kingdom of Heiress, which is known for its wheat plains. For this fall, there will be a lot of cereal. He mentions that if the problem is about the territory, then they will bring it somewhere else. In the north, there's a harsh winter every year, which is what Aslan is known for. Every year there are many invasions, but invaders back out as soon as they see the lion flag. Betty again explains to the Duke that the citizens can't underestimate the drought since people don't usually travel to the north, and people are desperate due to their plants being severely damaged. Thus, even if the Duke opens a warehouse in another kingdom, it might still be an empty one. Next, Betty shows the Duke a flower pot and hands it over to him. While looking at the tuberosum, the Duke remembers that these wildflowers are seen on the road, but he still finds them beautiful since Betty gave them to him. Betty then explained that tuberosum reproduces faster than any plant, thus solving the distribution problem and helping significantly during the drought. Sharing his opinion on the discussion, the butler tells Betty that even if it can be used as food during drought season, it still doesn't taste good. After hearing what the butler tells Betty, she tells him she also solved that problem. Betty then proceeds to show them the different ways she cooks the tuberosum. Betty introduced them to the following dishes: tuberosum soup, tuberosum cheese, tuberosum salad, steamed tuberosum, and various other tuberosum recipes. Betty tells the Duke that eating it is safe and tasty since she tastes it. The Duke then panics after hearing that Betty ate her experiment recipes and quickly instructs the butler to call the doctor. After checking on Betty, the doctor announced that Betty was fine. The Duke then tells Betty that she must care for her health since she is fragile, unlike him and Carl. Betty reminds herself not to overthink how caring the Duke treated her. Next, the Duke asks what Betty wants in return for the plans that she suggests. Betty then innocently tells the Duke that she wants to stay in the castle until she's grown up. In all honesty, the Duke must fix his communication skills so that Betty will not overthink everything. The Duke is stunned after realizing that all Betty wishes for is to stay at the castle and not return to the capital. The Duke then seriously declines Betty's wish. Hearing this, Betty quickly tells the Duke she has other plans and then asks for another chance. Betty also adds that she will pay the Duke while she is staying in the castle. The Duke again then tells her that she doesn't need to spend money when she's at home, and instructs her to return to her room and rest. Betty is mourning for a failed deal with the Duke, thus the maids ask her if she wants warm milk to make her feel better. Carl then arrives at Betty's room. Seeing Betty's miserable face, Carl pats Betty's head while asking her if she is bullied, even asking who the names are and offering to take care of them. Betty looks at her brother lovingly and tells him she's fine now. While lying in the bed, Betty realizes that the maids and Carl care for her so much, despite the fact that in the first place, all she wanted was a safe place to stay. But then after staying for a short period, Betty realizes that she wants to stay because of the people in the castle. Meanwhile, the Duke holds a meeting about Betty's stay at the castle. The Duke suddenly remembers the helplessness he felt the first time Betty was sick, since he could not do anything for her because Betty's body was weak and she couldn't withstand the North's coldness. The Duke informs him that he wants to send Betty back to the capital since the weather there is fine, but the Duke doesn't want Betty to be lonely. Thus, he is torn with the situation. The Duke then worries that Betty will again leave the capital if she gets homesick. The royal subject reminds him that it is best for Betty's health to stay in the capital. Still, the butler unconsciously tells the Duke that he noticed that Betty now looks strong, and that the butler has a niece the same age as Betty who went on a hunger strike just so she could get what she wants, thus making the Duke worry because he can't imagine Betty starving. The butler then tells the Duke that someone from the capital must take responsibility for not protecting Betty, to which the Duke agrees and instructs them to enhance the security to prevent further incidents from happening. Next, alone in the Duke's office, the butler informs the Duke that the investigation is starting regarding how the people in the capital treat Betty. The next day, Betty is surprised that her room is full of Adonis flowers and a giant toy squirrel with a gold acorn. The maid then informs Betty that it is a present from the Duke. Hearing this, Betty is shocked and thinks that maybe the Duke finally sees the value of her recipes. Next, Betty visits the Duke to give the letter she wrote. While opening the letter, the Duke thinks that Betty must like the present since she wrote a thank you letter to him. The Duke even makes a mental note that he will frame the letter Betty wrote. However, all the Duke's expectations of the letter fall down the drain after finding out that the letter is all about Betty's recipes. Betty then informs the Duke that she received the Duke's present, and then again tries to make a deal with him to make her stay at the castle until she's grown up. But the Duke flatly declines her again, thus making Betty bargain for at least just a year more at the castle, which is also rejected by the Duke. Looking at how sad Betty is, the Duke tells her that he can build a smaller castle in the capital. But Betty replies to her father that it is not about the castle. Betty again tells the Duke that she can also help in battles in other ways and will not be a burden to him. The Duke then pats the head of Betty, who he finds so adorable, but still declines Betty's deal to make her stay at the castle. Betty then notices getting a warm feeling after the Duke's action. In the following days, every morning, Betty is always welcomed with so many presents from the Duke, although she misunderstands this as the Duke trying to tell her that she needs to leave the castle. Next, the Duke is surprised to see Betty pulling a cart full of her presents. Betty then informs the Duke that she would like to return the gift and doesn't need it since she only wants to stay in the castle. The Duke realizes that his daughter is not mature for such a young age. Betty again asks for the Duke to make her stay in the castle, but this time she calls the Duke father. The Duke is then swayed and agrees to Betty that she can remain until winter comes. Finally, getting her wish, Betty feels excited and happy, so much so that her tail has grown out. In the capital, a parade is held to celebrate the victory of the Emperor, Nader Dexus Astrum, the ruler of the Kingdom of Astrum. As Nader is waving to the people, he overhears them talking about how cool Duke Aslan is, and that the victory is because of him. Hearing about the people's statements, Nader feels angry, but his wife tells him that they don't know anything, while also informing him that she already has a plan for everything. Nader's wife then faces the child leader and reminds him to do his best. Really, using a child to use your evil deed is too much. At night, in the office of Count Zelot, a man pays a visit to him, although the Count seems invested in him not doing so. The man then informs Zelot that he came in secret and that there is no evidence during the fire at the military house since his daughter died after doing the plan. Zelot then asks the man what he needs. The man greedily tells him that he wants more money in return for keeping the secret. Zelot tells the man that he understands and tells the man to approach him. When the man is near Zelot, the Count stabs the man with a knife. Zelot's butler then enters his office, and so the Count instructs him to clean up the mess. Zelot's butler agrees and also informs him that somebody from the capital wants to meet him. The following day, while Betty is thinking of a plan to stay in the castle for the next 10 years, she suddenly turns into a squirrel, thus making her decide to go somewhere else to think. On top of the tree, she sees the Duke talking to his butler about the meaning of Betty's name and how it was made. After learning that the Duke made an effort and was meticulous in naming her, she realized that maybe the Duke didn't hate her that much. Of course not! The Duke loves you so much and he worries about your health. The following day, Betty is in the kitchen, busy making cookies out of tubersum. While making the cookies, she cannot help but think about how the Duke put so many thoughts into naming her. But she easily brushes it off and reminds herself to focus on making the cookies. Betty wants to use the tubersum cookies to increase the value of the contract of her stay in the castle. After baking the cookies, Betty then prepares a drink for the Duke. While walking toward the office of the Duke to deliver the cookies and the drink Betty made, she suddenly sees someone in the hallway. After realizing it is her aunt, Betty freezes and drops the tray on the floor. Betty's aunt then asks how she is, all the while Betty is shaking with terror. Betty's aunt then tells her that she's still clumsy, just like before, and also, without a shred of truth, tells Betty that she's concerned about her niece, while hardly pinching Betty's cheeks. Betty remembers how her aunt pretends to care for her, but then scolds and hits her when her aunt feels like it. But Betty then realizes after staying in the castle that she needs to defend herself. Thus, Betty shoves the hand of her aunt away. In response, Betty's aunt scolds and shouts at her, saying that she's disrespecting her. But Betty bravely replies, loudly telling her aunt she's hurting her. Betty's aunt then hears the maid commenting that Betty's cheeks are red, thus making her act up. The Duke arrives shortly after at the scene and asks what's going on, which makes Betty's aunt, Perina, try to get the Duke's attention by greeting him. The Duke, full of concern, just walks past her and approaches Betty, asking her if it's too heavy, thus making her drop the tray. Betty innocently tells the Duke that she cooked it for him. Hearing this, the Duke then unconsciously reaches for the scattered cookies, but is stopped by the maids. Perina comments on how slow the servants in the castles are, and that the Duke may send them to the capital for her to train. The Duke annoyingly tells Betty's aunt to stop, while stopping his anger since he doesn't want Betty to see him angry. The Duke then tells Betty to return to her room and instructs Perina to get inside the Duke's office. While there, Betty's aunt stares at the Duke's handsome face, unconsciously fixing her hair. Next, the Duke asks Perina to explain to Betty why she did all those things. Betty's aunt tries to deny it, but the Duke becomes angry and slams the table using his fist while shouting and asking Perina why she hurt Betty when in fact, she is tasked to take care of his daughter. Perina still tries to deny that she's hurting Betty at the capital and blames Betty for running away. She then adds that she always sends letters and reports about Betty's state. The Duke then asks Perina why he has not been informed of Betty's talent. Perina curiously thinks that Betty is not talented since after her sister died, Perina got rid of all the books because she's afraid to argue pointlessly with Betty. The Duke also tells Perina that she has no right to arrange a marriage for Betty without asking for his opinion. Perina starts to realize that she does not have any more excuses. She pretends to faint and says that she misses her sister so much. The Duke does not buy her excuse and informs Perina that he has had enough of her and that even if his wife asked him to take care of her sister, it's no longer on the table after Perina hurt Betty. Afterwards, he instructs Perina to clean her own guest room. Next, in Perina's room, she eagerly sits on her couch and shouts that she doesn't even want to take care of Betty in the first place, and that she's doing it because of the plan. Perina then looks at the potion and thinks to herself that the Duke, the most handsome and powerful husband in the kingdom, will be hers soon. All she needs is to make him drink the potion. While Betty is preparing to go out the following day, a maid hands her a letter from the Duke. Betty is so excited even for a simple letter since in the past, she had not received any letters from the Duke, even if she had sent a lot to him. Betty then carefully placed the letter together with the other letters inside the gold acorn. The mood changes, however, when Perina enters Betty's room. Perina mockingly praises Betty, commenting on how cute she is and asks if she can take a look at what Betty is holding. We'll stop here for today, guys. Yes, I know you want more. Don't forget to ask for the next part in the comment section. Thank you guys for watching and for your support. Please subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. Till the next one.